Today we are going to do the first part of our sock monkeys. So the things that you are going to need for this first part are going to be scissors, a needle, thread, and one of your socks. So what I'm going to do first is I am going to be cutting because today we are going to be creating the legs of the sock monkey. So we're going to be making the legs. So what I've done is I've taken one of the socks and I have opened it up so that the heel is upward. So normally your socks tend to look like this. Okay, so what I've done is I have opened it up and I've kind of had it folded in the reverse way so that the heel is up. Now this pair of socks actually has kind of a seam down the middle where the stripes were changing colors. So what I've done is I've pretty much centered that seam and then I'm going to get ready to cut it. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to cut through both layers. And in my case, I'm just going to cut right down that seam. And then I'm going to stop when I have about 1.5 inches from the heel. Okay. What I'm also going to do is just round the ends just a little bit on each of the corners. And that's going to make it a little easier for your stitching, and it'll also make the feet a little more rounded rather than super square. All right, I'm just going to kind of play around with it so that I like the shape. So there's my little rounded feet. Kind of move all of these little scraps out of the way. Now, just with any other project that we do with our sewing, we are going to need to sew our legs together inside out so that our seams will be on the inside. So you want to be careful because you don't want to be pulling those threads too much, but you're just going to very carefully turn your sock inside out. And then you're just going to be matching those edges together. All right. With mine, I'm going to try to match the stripes. And if you want, you can use some pins to keep them together. I'm just going to keep them together and move them as I go and as I'm stitching it. But you're just going to be matching up both sides for your legs. Now, with my needle and thread, I'm using orange thread just so that it's a little easier for you to be able to see. But try to use thread that's as close to your socks as possible. And you can also use a longer length of thread. And I'm going to use this shorter length so that I can give you a little bit of a review on attaching new thread. So I've just tied a knot. I do have it double thickness. Okay, so I've got my thread through my needle. The fold is at the needle. The two ends are tied together and they're even. And I just did my knot how we normally do, wrapping it around the finger, sliding it off. I'm going to trim my end a little bit. And I am going to be using what's called a blanket stitch. I like this stitch a little better when I'm doing hand stitched seams because it doesn't pull the fabric as much. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my needle. I'm going to go through both layers of fabric or of the sock. All right, make sure that you pull it so that the knot is all the way up against the sock or the fabric of the sock. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle right through where my knot is and pull it through. And before I pull that loop all the way through, I'm going to put my needle into the loop. So that's my initial stitch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be continuing with that line with my stitches pretty close together. And once I put it through, again, before I pull that knot through or pull the loop through, I'm going to put my needle through the loop and pull it through. And what will end up happening is there will actually be a bar of stitching right along that edge of the fabric. And that, like I said, keeps it from kind of gathering up as you stitch. If you were just to be going in and out around your fabric, sometimes if you were to pull it too hard, it would gather that fabric up and it wouldn't lay smooth. So this one allows you to have nice, sturdy and strong stitches, and it doesn't gather up your fabric. So I'm just going to continue with that. So every time I stitch, I always put my needle into my loop. And pull it nice and tight. And you can see that that bar of stitching is forming. This stitch can also be used as a decorative stitch when you're attaching things onto projects, which would be called applique. But I find that it makes a really good seam stitch as well. Now I've gotten to a point where my thread is pretty short, so I do want to tie it off. And what I want to do is pretty much just make another stitch so that I can tie it off like we do for most of our other hand stitching. So if you look closely, there we have that bar, and my thread is underneath the bar. So what I want to do is I want to just put my needle through where the thread is so that I create another stitch. And again, I don't want to pull my loop all the way through. And I want to determine which side moves less. So if I kind of pull back and forth, I find that this side moves less, so I'm just going to wrap my needle with the thread. And then I just push those twists down so that I create a knot. And then I can trim the thread. And then what I can do is get another piece of thread. And I'll start it the same way that I did at the beginning. So I'll have my double thickness. And then I'll just start where I ended. Wrap around to that initial stitch and make sure that I put my needle through the loop before I pull it through. and then I can continue on. If you end up with a funny loop, just separate your two threads, pull them individually until you figure out which side has the loop in it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to continue up the leg, but you want to stop about 1/2 inch to 1 inch from the top of your cut. And then you're going to do the same thing, the same stitching on the other side, and again, leave an opening about 1/2 inch to 1 inch from the top of your cut. I've sewn both of my legs going from the bottom around to the middle, and I've left an opening right here. That is going to be where we are going to be putting the stuffing. It's important that you don't try to do your stitching with a length of thread that's so long to try to get all the way around. It's a lot better if you use shorter lengths, and just tie them off and then start with a new one. A lot of times what will happen if you're using a really long piece, it can end up getting tangled up or knotted up and you won't be able to get it out, and it'll become very frustrating for you. So use smaller lengths of thread to stitch around your legs. Once you have completed stitching both of your legs, what I'd like you to do is take a picture of your stitching, showing me all of your little stitches along your legs, and then posting that picture or multiple pictures into the Google Classroom assignment.